As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So on Wednesday, the Senate passed the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, and this is the bill that funds the Pentagon. It also includes some funds for other government agencies' military spending, such as the Energy Department's nuclear weapons program, but the bulk of it, the majority of it, goes to the Pentagon. And the bill passed in a vote of 87-13, so it got lots of support. 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent, which is Bernie Sanders, voted against it. And now the NDAA heads to the House, where it is expected to pass in a vote on Thursday. So this NDAA, the way it works, the House creates their version of the bill, the Senate creates their version, and then the 2 chambers negotiate. So this is the finalized version. So it's expected to go through the House, and then it goes to President Biden's desk to be signed into law. And this is a process I usually follow pretty closely this time of year. In the fall into the winter is when these negotiations are usually going on. But with everything that's been happening with Gaza, I mean, I've barely paid attention, been able to really follow it. So I'm not sure of all the horrible things that are in here. I'm going to try to find out, what kind of new things there are. All this stuff is really bad that's packed into this bill, but they always try to add new things. So one thing that's in this that is really bad is that it will extend Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and that gives the FBI the power to conduct warrantless spying of Americans and foreigners. It's designed to give them the power to conduct surveillance of foreigners, but it applies to any Americans that they might be talking to, that interacting with. And this has been abused, so horribly. It gives them just so much power to spy on us. And it was due to expire at the end of this year, but this NDAA pushes it back to April 19th. So it's a temporary extension until they can either extend it even more or find some other new form of this. But they don't want to give this spying power up. Now, there was a bipartisan group of senators that tried to stop this and tried to strip the Section 702 extension from the NDAA, but their efforts failed. So they actually only needed 41 senators to remove this provision. It's for procedural reasons. I couldn't really figure out why that's all they needed. But anyway, they needed 41 senators, but they only got 35. Houthi officials said on Wednesday that the only way to restore calm in the Red Sea is through a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and this comes amid reports of another Houthi attack in the waters. So Yemen's Houthi movement, formerly known as Ansar Allah, has been targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea that they claim are Israeli-linked or bound for Israel, and they've been doing this in response to what Israel's doing in Gaza. They have also fired missiles and drones at Israeli territory. So this is Abdul Malik al-Ajri. He's a member of Ansar Allah's political bureau. He said, quote, "There is no way of preventing the escalation except by moving towards a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip," end quote. The U.S. has been considering forming an international naval coalition to patrol the waters off Yemen's coast, but al-Ajri said even if all the fleets in the world gathered in the Red Sea, it would, quote, "not bring security to Israel or Israeli ships, not to any ships headed to Israel," end quote. So also on Wednesday, a U.S. military official told Reuters that the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Mason shot down a Houthi drone that was headed in its direction as it was responding to an attack on a commercial vessel, the tanker Ardmore Encounter. The official said the Houthis attacked the tanker with skiffs and fired 2 missiles that missed. So as I covered yesterday, the Biden administration is threatening to kill a peace plan between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in response to the attacks in the Red Sea. The U.S. is considering redesignating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, which would make the first phase of a Saudi-Houthi peace deal that's been reached that I wasn't aware of before yesterday, that they actually have agreed on a peace deal that could be implemented. But if the U.S. does that designation, it would make the first phase impossible. So, the U.S. is considering very extreme measures here. Donald Tusk, he is Poland's new pro-EU prime minister. He was sworn in on Wednesday and delivered a speech the day before where he vowed that his government would push for the West to continue supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia. So Tusk, who previously served as prime minister from 2007 to 2014, promised Poland's, quote, "full involvement with Ukraine in this cruel conflict with the Russian aggressor," end quote. He also said that he was fed up with European politicians and other countries from the West, politicians who said they were getting tired of the situation in Ukraine. He said it is the task of the Polish government to, quote, "loudly and firmly demand the full determination from the entire Western community to help Ukraine in this war. I will do this from day one," end quote. So Poland has been a very staunch supporter of the proxy war since the Russian invasion. But if you remember a few months ago, Tusk's predecessor, Mateusz Morawiecki, said that Warsaw was done arming Ukraine. They had this big spat over Ukrainian grain. There was a glut of Ukrainian grain coming into Poland, and Poland banned the import, or maybe they let it travel through to other parts of Europe, but they didn't want to sell it on their market because Polish farmers weren't happy. And Zelensky got all upset about it, and they had kind of this public spat. And then he said, yeah, we're not giving you weapons anymore. And it was kind of seen as a pre-election move to appeal to his base. But it was still significant because it showed a kind of a big fracture in NATO support for Ukraine. Because, again, Poland was a big supporter of all this. But now Tusk is in, and Poland's back, all in on the proxy war.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Disagree with what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. Voltaire said that. And you go on to write, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he included in it a list of the colonists' grievances with the British government. Notably absent were any complaints that the British government infringed upon the freedom of speech.
They didn't infringe upon the freedom of the colonists' speech. That didn't start until we had a federal government here. And the federal government enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize the federal government. And people, including a congressman by the name of Matthew Lyons from Vermont, were prosecuted and convicted under it. The column catalogs a long list of excesses by presidents and Congresses until 1969, when the Supreme Court finally said, forget it. All innocuous speech is absolutely protected, and all speech is innocuous when there is time for more speech to challenge it. The whole purpose of the First Amendment is to keep the government out of the business of speech. So what business does the Congress have subpoenaing college presidents saying, you didn't protect certain groups of your students from harmful speech? You don't deserve to be a college president. The Congress has nothing to say about speech. We're not talking about speech at West Point, which the government owns. That's a different story. We're talking about speech on a private university campus, and Congress is berating college presidents because they were silent in the face of speech that Congress hates. What speech does Congress hate? Well, I'll give you a guess. The House of Representatives voted 416-1 to condemn anti-Semitism without defining what the heck it meant. So if you say on a college campus today, stop the slaughter of Palestinians, the Congress wants you to provide a forum for the slaughter to be defended. And if you don't, they will call you before Congress and berate you. That's the depth to which we have sunk today. That is the rejection of their oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution by 416-1. The one is Congressman Thomas Massie, of course. He's the personification of courage.
You have here, stated differently, each of the signatories of the Declaration and all of the ratifiers of the Bill of Rights manifested in writing the unambiguous understanding that the freedom of speech is a natural right, personal to every human. It does not come from the government. It comes from within us. It cannot be taken away by legislation or executive command or popular will. They were 100% wrong.
It is being taken away by legislation, by executive command, and by popular will, by browbeating people into a sense of conformity, by scaring people away from expressing certain views. This congresswoman from Michigan sang a song, "From the ocean to the sea, Palestine will be free," and she was censured by the House of Representatives. Even the British Parliament doesn't censure for making statements that are against the grain.
Right here, you said, yet in perilous times like the present, we have seen zealots use Congress, the police, and public opinion to block speech that they hate. And I want to stop right at that because, again, going back to what happened with this, with the college presidents, they were saying that they supported these students that was saying, I don't know the exact words, but, we have to destroy all Israelis or kill the Israelis.
The students chanted the same song that the congresswoman chanted. It's a song. From the ocean to the sea, Palestine will be free. And these members of Congress were berating presidents because they permitted that free speech, because they didn't speak out against it. That's
Well,
what.
they also claim that these students said other things.
Yes.
And the fact is that they asked to show a video or anything of them saying that, and they couldn't come up with one of them. This representation of American history, the country that our founding fathers fought for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that have been stolen from us in front of everybody's eyes for all to see. You go on, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln locked up thousands of journalists in the North who were critical of his war efforts. During World War I, President Wilson, who my alma mater, president of Princeton University, is trying to erase from its memory, arrested students for reading the Declaration of Independence aloud or singing German beer hall songs. Now, I'm mentioning this, again, you got to read what the judge is writing here, but what's important about this, 2 wars, Abraham Lincoln's murderous war that killed what, some 700,000 people, destroyed the South?
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson's murderous war that dragged the United States into it. We're fighting for democracy. I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy. They do this at wartime, just like they're silencing us now as wars are raging.
The silencing of us now is a prelude to war, because as you have said countless times, better than anybody else, Gerald, when all else fails, they take you to war.
Your daily dose of Liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2429 of The Tom Woods Show.
All right, y'all. Welcome to the Scott Wharton Show. It's episode 5973 of the Scott Wharton Show. I'm the director of the Institute, what just published your brand new book, Diary of a Psychosis, How Public Health Disgraced Itself During COVID Mania. This one was very personal to me. It was a good friend of mine, a writer for us at antiwar.com, Reese Ehrlich, who is a leftist, and a longtime activist and a great journalist. I mean, he would go to war zones like Patrick Coburn and those guys and wrote a great book about the war in Syria. And he was a great regular guest on my show and a great, I don't know, friend, but a close and nice acquaintance of mine. And they killed him with this stuff. Yeah, I mean, his story, if it wasn't previously unpublished, it would belong right in collateral damage there. And it was his last article for antiwar.com was how I think he'd been forced for whatever bureaucratic reason to switch from Blue Cross to Kaiser Permanente out there in California. And then they just refused to see him, even though he knew he had colon cancer. And they just told him, nah, it's a slow-growing cancer. He'll be fine. And they put him off and put him off and put him off. And he finally was able to go to the doctor, I think, in January of 21 or maybe December of 20. And they said, oh, yeah, no, sorry, you're stage 4, pal. You're done. It's in your liver, in your brain, in your everything, whatever it was. And so he wrote his last article for antiwar.com. He's like, well, sayonara, pal. I guess I'm a dead man.
And he died?
Yeah, he died right after that, Tom. Like in February or something. He lasted another couple of weeks after that. And he just said, like, well, I know I'm dead, so if anybody wants to write me a nice email about a nice time we ever had somewhere or whatever, geez, I always thought I'd grow old and write my memoirs and have a nice life and look at my grandchildren and grow up. And anyway, bye. And then that was it. He was dead. And imagine, I mean, in California, in the land was supposed to be the most wealthy and advanced state in the most wealthy and advanced country in the world. They refused to treat this guy who he wasn't destitute, living in a gutter, and somehow the social safety net missed him or whatever. He had a job, Tom. He had health insurance, and he couldn't get treatment. They refused to see him because they knew he was dying of cancer, but they refused to treat him because the healthcare workers, supposedly, or their bosses, were afraid that they would get a respiratory virus. And what in the world is that? Who's making those calculations to decide that at my friend Reese's expense? You wrote all these essays. It's 3 years worth of emails that you sent out about all of this stuff, railing against this stuff. But at some point you decided to do what I know that you had already decided you did not want to do anymore, which is make a book out of it and publish it. So what was it that you tell us? Was there a story there, or was it just you decided for a specific reason that you wanted to do it this way?
So I don't want to write a book that's just like a chapter on masks and a chapter on lockdowns. I want to walk people through, if not day by day, at least in chronological order, as the madness unfolded and what we were all thinking and what was happening and what the numbers were showing, what the graphs all said. And you're right, Scott, about this format makes it possible to look back and say, oh, well, somebody actually knew by X month of X year what was really happening. So in flipping through the book just now, I just discovered that there's a guy named David Leonhardt who writes for the New York Times. And maybe about a year and a half ago, I guess 2 years ago, he started writing a column consistently in his own newsletter that you would get through the New York Times about COVID. And it was his job to gradually and slowly break it to the readers of the New York Times that none of this crazy nonsense they'd been doing had really accomplished anything. But he didn't start saying that until October 2021. October 2021, the damage is all done. The developing world is decimated by this. In Myanmar, they're reporting that people were eating rats and snakes because when they have no incomes, this is how they have to eat to feed their families. Takes him till October 2021 to bother to look at the charts and say, you know what? Doesn't seem like it made any difference. Well, I kind of figured that out early on, and not because I have great insight, just because I like listening to dissident voices. And they're not always right, but sometimes they are. And obviously there was a tremendous groupthink and herd mentality going on in early 2020. So I actively sought out people who weren't part of that. And I want to know, why do you have a different point of view? What are you basing it on? And then I would just look at the charts, and the charts told all the stories.
They sure did. I mean, it was, I think, the first or second time I was on Kennedy's show on Fox News. I said, go look at Tom's charts. None of this made the difference, the covidcharts.com or whatever the site there.
Oh, yeah, covidchartsquiz.com. Yeah, that was, I'm happy about that whole thing too. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely something to brag about. I mean, the whole thing when I'm reading it reminded me of the weapons of mass destruction, right? It's like reading Raimondo about the WMDs. Like, I'll never forget, because there's like a scene in my living room that coincided with it when the antiwar.com ran the headline from the Washington Post in September 2002 that those aluminum tubes, those are for rockets. You could never use those for a centrifuge, man. Don't give me a break. So says every actual expert on Earth, and including the horrible David Albright, who was probably an Israeli spy anyway. And even he debunked it. And then, Tom, they kept talking about the aluminum tubes like they hadn't already been debunked in the Post for months and months and months. They kept saying aluminum tubes. Why we got to invade Iraq? Tom, get this. Aluminum tubes.
Yeah.
That's why I got to invade Iraq. And that's what it's like reading your book. It's like, wait a minute, man. You can't be sitting here in December and then in March and then in August again telling me what Tom already debunked last July. It ain't right. You can't keep using the aluminum tubes after they've been debunked, man. And they just keep doing it. And it's frustrating in a way to go back and see just how thoroughly you knew better and when. Not you guessed better, and not your libertarian principle would never give in to their policy anyway, but knew better, demonstratively knew better by X date. I don't want to root for it. I'm already saying too much, but you knew so soon. And then the whole rest of the book takes place after that.
Yeah.
And I'm just sitting here hitting myself in the head the whole time going, I can't believe this.
The Peter Schiff Show. Now, the way the mainstream media is framing this is that the Fed won. This is the victory dance. The Fed has won the inflation fight, and that's why it doesn't have to hike rates anymore. Rate hikes are over, and we can now look forward to rate cuts that are going to be starting next year, maybe early next year. And of course, the market is celebrating. The Dow is up better than 500 points today. In fact, it set a new all-time record high. The Dow closed above 37,000 for the first time ever. And the intraday high, I'm reading it, was 37,094.85. Now, even though the Dow hit a record, it wasn't the biggest gainer on the day. The Russell 2000 was up like 3.5%. Although that's the only index that didn't hit a 52-week high. The S&P 500 and the NASDAQ hit new highs for the year, although only the Dow set a record high. Although I do want to put that record in its proper context, because the mainstream media will never do that. So if you take the price of gold of approximately $2,000 an ounce, although right now it is trading above that by a comfortable margin. Let me check on the current price of gold. It's at $22,040 almost, so $40 above 2,000. But if you just figure about 2,000, just to make the math easy, at 37,000, the Dow is roughly 18.5 ounces of gold. So that's the price of the Dow if you buy it with gold. Well, that's not a record high, not even close. In fact, in 1966, the Dow was about 20 ounces of gold. So from the 1966 peak to today, in terms of real money, the Dow is actually lower than it was in 1966. In fact, it's maybe lower than it was in 1929 in terms of gold. But if you want to know where the record high was, it was 1999, not that long ago. In 1999, the Dow cost 42 ounces of gold, almost. That's the all-time record. The Dow has never been more expensive, priced in real money, than it was in 1999. Now, that's how big that bubble was during that decade. But we're still down 55+% from that record. So the price of the Dow in gold would have to double from here in order to get that record, to reclaim that record. So it's not going to happen. But the reason you want to think about the price of the Dow in terms of gold is because gold has real value. You can't measure it in terms of the dollar. The dollar's lost 99% of its value relative to gold since the beginning of the Federal Reserve. So obviously, the price of everything is going to go up when you're measuring it with something that's gone down by 99%. So you take that out of it and you look at the real value, and it's not a record. But historically, the Dow is expensive. 18.5 ounces of gold is a high price. The Dow does not deserve a high price. I think the Dow should actually have a low price. There are so many problems looming on the horizon for the U.S. stock market that it should be trading at a discount to its historic average, not at a premium. I think we have a long way to go on the downside for the real value of the Dow. Now, I don't know, nominally, the Dow could keep rising. And in fact, after today, I expect the U.S. stock market to keep rising. Not for the right reasons, but for the wrong reasons. But it looks like the Dow's going to go up. I don't recommend buying it because I think foreign stocks will beat the Dow. I think emerging markets will beat the Dow. I think gold stocks will beat it. So I think that there are better horses to be on. And I do think, though, that the Dow is going to do better than the NASDAQ. I think that this new rally is going to be led by value stocks, even in the U.S. Real businesses are going to be the drivers this time, not the pie-in-the-sky, hyped-up companies. That's one of the reasons that the Dow outperformed the NASDAQ today. So I think that shift is taking place. But there's a much broader shift that most investors haven't even noticed, and that's the shift to international stocks, to international value, emerging markets, commodities, natural resources, gold. These are the trends that I think are going to dominate going forward. They are going to cut, and they don't give a damn about inflation. If they really wanted to make sure inflation was gone and dead and buried, they would wait for 2%. In fact, they would want to let it go below 2% for a while just to make sure it stayed there. Like, what if you just touch 2% and then immediately go right back up? I mean, what good is it, right? This is all a bunch of BS. Reporter asked him, that same reporter said, well, what about 3% then? I mean, if we're below 3%, is that good to go? Is that when you can start cutting rates? And Powell said, well, I don't want to put a number on it. I don't want to have any specific level, which probably means it doesn't even have to be under 3%. It could be over 3%, and they're going to keep cutting because the cuts have got nothing to do with inflation. They're not cutting because they won the inflation war. Again, they're cutting because the economy can't afford to win the inflation war. So inflation have won, and we're cutting to bail everybody else out.
Anyway, there was a vote yesterday on NDAA. I recall it very much in the presidential campaigns because I was fascinated that when I went to college campuses, they seemed to be a step ahead of me. They seemed to know and was excited about it a little bit before I was, but they got my attention. Yeah. And we spent a lot of time on that. Then we dealt with the legislation and all and how evil it has. And here, all we've been trying to do is rein in some of the bad things on the Patriot Act, along with how they get things extended. So this was an extension, but it's bad enough that they just go ahead and do it anyway and spy on us. Nobody should assume that the federal government doesn't spy on anybody they want, and they did that before they had Section 702. But there should be at least an image of the Congress and the people saying, no, this is not right. You shouldn't be doing this. That is not intended in the Constitution. But nevertheless, it passed the Senate yesterday, and we were thinking before our program started, well, maybe we could talk about it and tell them, get involved here, call your congressman, make sure your vote's right on this. But the vote has already occurred, and it was not a victory for the Fourth Amendment. It was, the bill was passed, which means not only the 702, that's passed all that money also. Yeah. And the money, it says it's 886 billion. You could round it off to $1 trillion. Yeah. You say, well, that's stretching it. No, it's minimizing it because you have to figure there'll be another bill soon, and they'll eventually get money for Ukraine. It'll go on and on, but there's always going to be an emergency. And right now they have a lot of choices. They want that $111 billion they want is for Ukraine, Israel, and also Taiwan. Yeah, and so there'll be an American ship sunk or something, and then if anybody opposes them, it would be equivalent to the unity that 9/11 brought on. But anyway, the NDAA passed, and that means some effort made it, and they did try to curtail that, and they had one vote there to try to strip it, and because they had to have 2/3 vote, they almost were able to strip the 702 from there, but that didn't happen, and it's a shame, but I think people become numb to this. They might hear about it and say, that's terrible, terrible. And then, what am I going to do about it? Well, some days we feel that way too, but what we can do, the best thing we can do is try to call attention to people and to say that this is not going to stop until the people say enough is enough. And that's how things get changed. And in certain things in recent years, there have been a few things where the people just say enough is enough and we don't want you, hounding us to death. Certainly the COVID lockdown issues, that shifted when the people woke up.
Yeah, as you say, if they just dealt with this bill, there would be a debate, and it might not pass because Americans might say, we don't want this anymore. And that's why they sneak it in.
Yeah.
Well, here's Ed Snowden did a tweet this morning after it passed, and he's obviously disgusted, if we can put it up. He's obviously disgusted with what happened. And here's what he said. Congress has voted to pass the NDAA, in which they deceitfully concealed an extension of the warrantless spying program, Section 702, universally opposed by the public. Good point. And listen to this part. Last year, the FBI exploited 702 to spy on Americans, and that's protesters, donors, even Congress, more than 200,000 times. So,
if we're not careful, they might even start spying for political reasons and checking in on these other candidates and getting illegal warrants to spy. That's really when it gets bad, because that's when they get the Department of Justice on their side and the courts.
That clip, by the way, they're back at it again. The same group. It's not every one of them, but that group, as you say, they overthrew the election. It wasn't the Russians who interfered. It was all these former intelligence officers. They signed a letter saying, well, in our vast experience with intelligence, we can say that the Hunter Biden laptop is classic Russian disinformation. They just flat out lied, Dr. Paul, and everyone knows it. As you say, it affected the elections. Well, normal people who are not nihilists, as you write a lot about, who are not sociopaths, they would probably shrink away and just not go public again. They would feel some disgrace. Not these guys. They're back, and they signed a new letter saying, keep spying on Americans. It's good for us.
That's how we maintain our power and our cash flow.
Yeah.
So the military people seem to do well. If you can become a general and then you retire, you've taken the course to become that type of a lobbyist. But then you have the media that are participating in it. But we see that all the time too. The media participate in it. They had to participate in the lockdown. I mean, look at all the scare tactics that were put up by the government.
Yeah.
But if independent sources, if physicians or anybody did and tried to give a different spin on this, they'd lose their job.
Yeah.
They wouldn't lose their reputation. With the good people, their reputation goes way up.
Yeah.
But they lose their jobs, and some of them are still recovering from it.
Yeah, absolutely.